The collapse did not come with warning. It arrived in the quietest, cruelest way possible, in the space between a breath and the next heartbeat, when Katie Logan felt a pressure in her chest that was not pain at first, but an alarming heaviness, as if the air itself had thickened around her. She tried to dismiss it, as she had dismissed so many signs before, telling herself that stress was temporary, that fear was exaggerated, that her heart had survived worse. But this time, her body betrayed her certainty. Her vision blurred, her strength faltered, and within minutes the illusion of control shattered. The ambulance lights cutting through the streets of Los Angeles marked the beginning of a crisis that would not remain confined to a hospital room, but would ripple outward, tearing open old wounds and igniting a war fueled by love, guilt, and rage. At the hospital, the atmosphere was heavy with restrained panic. Doctors spoke in measured tones, nurses moved with practiced urgency, and machines hummed with the indifferent rhythm of survival. The words, cardiac complications, hung in the air like a verdict, too clinical to capture the terror they carried. For the Logan family, the waiting room became a battlefield of emotions. Fear intertwined with memory, each second stretching unbearably long as they confronted the possibility that Katie's fragile heart might not withstand another assault. They had lived through this before, but familiarity did not dull the dread. If anything, it sharpened it. When Bill Spencer received the call, the world seemed to tilt. The man known across industries as Dollar Bill, the ruthless titan who thrived on pressure and conflict, was momentarily stripped of every defense he had built. The news did not simply alarm him, it detonated something primal. In that instant, Bill was not a mogul, not a strategist, not a conqueror. He was a man confronting the unbearable truth that the woman he loved, the woman he had hurt and tried endlessly to protect in his own destructive way, was fighting for her life. Shock gave way to fury with terrifying speed. Bill's mind did what it had always done when faced with helplessness, it searched for a target. Katie's condition could not exist in a vacuum. Stress, betrayal, relentless pressure, someone, something, had pushed her too far. And in Bill's worldview, suffering always had an author. The instinct to protect mutated into the instinct to punish. If Katie's heart was breaking under the weight of conflict, then Bill would make certain that the source of that conflict paid dearly. His thoughts turned immediately to Forrester Creations, a name that carried decades of rivalry, resentment, and unfinished business. In Bill's mind, the tension surrounding Katie's new fashion venture, the constant comparisons, the subtle dismissals, and the pressure exerted by a world dominated by the Forresters, had become intolerable. He convinced himself that this environment, this ongoing war of legacy and power, had pushed Katie's already vulnerable heart beyond its limits. That belief hardened into resolve. Bill did not announce his intentions. He never did. He moved silently, decisively, activating networks of influence that spanned finance, media, and law. What had begun as Katie's independent fashion company, a symbol of her resilience and desire to step out of old shadows, became something far more dangerous in Bill's hands. He infused it with capital, shielded it from risk, and reshaped it into a weapon. Every strategic move was calculated not merely to compete with Forrester Creations, but to destabilize it. Contracts were challenged, suppliers were tempted away, narratives were subtly rewritten in the press. Bill understood that modern warfare did not require direct confrontation. It required pressure applied at exactly the right fault lines. As the conflict escalated, the industry felt the tremors. Designers, executives, and investors found themselves caught between two titans locked in an increasingly personal struggle. The rivalry was no longer about fashion or innovation, it was about dominance, about whose legacy would stand unchallenged. Bill's actions carried the unmistakable signature of obsession. He was not satisfied with success. He wanted retribution. And with every blow he landed, he told himself he was doing it for Katie. Yet inside the hospital room, the woman at the center of the storm lay pale and exhausted, her body tethered to machines that measured every fragile beat of her heart. When Katie learned what Bill was doing, fear eclipsed even her physical pain. She knew Bill better than anyone. She understood how easily his love transformed into destruction, how his need to protect often consumed everything in its path. Weak as she was, she summoned the strength to oppose him, to plead not with his power, but with his humanity. She feared that his vengeance would only deepen the wounds he claimed to avenge, that the stress of an all-out war would echo back into her own failing heart. Bill, however, was deaf to caution. Every attempt Katie made to slow him down felt, to him, like surrender. He interpreted her resistance as exhaustion, as the voice of someone too kind to demand justice. That misinterpretation widened the gulf between them. Love and control tangled together, until Bill could no longer distinguish where one ended and the other began. The more Katie begged him to stop, the more convinced he became that stopping would mean failing her. On the opposite side of the battlefield, Ridge Forrester and Brooke Logan found themselves forced into a defensive posture they had long anticipated, but hoped to avoid. They recognized Bill's tactics immediately. This was not business competition, it was personal annihilation disguised as strategy. Ridge bristled at the implication that Forrester Creations was responsible for Katie's condition, seeing it as an unforgivable distortion of reality. Brooke, torn between loyalty to her sister and her life with Ridge, felt the familiar ache of divided allegiance. Their confrontation with Bill was inevitable. When it came, it was charged with years of unresolved animosity. Ridge stood firm, refusing to let Bill rewrite the narrative of blame. Brooke appealed to Bill's past with Katie, reminding him that love had never thrived under siege. But Bill's eyes reflected a man already committed to a path that allowed no retreat. To him, Ridge represented everything that had ever threatened his happiness with Katie. Forrester Creations was not just a company, it was a symbol of all the forces that had kept him and Katie apart. As the war intensified, the cost became increasingly visible. Employees whispered about instability, alliances shifted, and once solid relationships fractured under the strain. The fashion world watched in fascination and fear as two empires collided, each move escalating the stakes. What no one could ignore was the timing. Katie's condition worsened even as the battle raged, her heart struggling against the relentless emotional turbulence surrounding her. The irony was devastating. The war fought in her name was slowly destroying her. Then came the moment that changed everything. In the early hours of a restless night, alarms sounded in Katie's hospital room. Her heart rhythm destabilized, plunging doctors into urgent action. The medical crisis unfolded with brutal clarity, leaving no room for denial. This was not a warning. It was a reckoning. When Bill was summoned, the reality he had avoided crashed down on him with merciless force. The doctors spoke plainly. Stress was no longer an abstract concept, it was a measurable threat. Katie's life hung in the balance, and the margin for error was gone. Standing at her bedside, watching the rise and fall of her chest, Bill was confronted with a choice he could no longer postpone. Every instinct screamed at him to keep fighting, to finish what he had started, to ensure that no one ever hurt Katie again. But for the first time, the consequences of that instinct were undeniable. Revenge was no longer theoretical. It had a pulse, a rhythm, a heartbeat struggling to survive. Katie, barely conscious, became his mirror. In her vulnerability, Bill saw the truth he had refused to face, that his need to control outcomes had always been his greatest flaw. Protecting her did not mean eliminating enemies. It meant honoring her wishes, even when they contradicted his own impulses. The realization did not come gently. It tore through him, stripping away the armor he had worn for decades. The choice he faced was absolute. Continue the war and risk losing Katie forever, or step back, dismantle the machinery of vengeance he had set in motion, and accept a kind of defeat that felt more terrifying than any business loss. For a man like Bill Spencer, surrender had always been unthinkable. Yet as he held Katie's hand, feeling its frailty, surrender took on a new meaning. It was not weakness. It was survival. What Bill chose in that moment would reshape everything. Not just the fate of two powerful companies, but the lives intertwined with them. The outcome would determine whether love could finally triumph over ego, whether a heart broken too many times could still be saved, not by force, but by restraint. And as the machines continued their steady vigil, one truth stood above all others: power could build empires and destroy enemies, but it could not restart a failing heart. In the world of the bold and the beautiful, this crisis would be remembered not as another corporate war, but as the moment when love and vengeance stood face to face, and only one could be chosen. Bill did not leave the hospital after that night. The man who once measured time in board meetings and stock fluctuations now measured it in heartbeats, in the slight rise and fall of Katie's chest, in the cautious optimism of a nurse's nod or the tightening of a doctor's jaw. The machines beside her bed became his only market indicators, their steady rhythm the sole metric that mattered. For the first time in his life, Bill Spencer was forced into stillness, and that stillness was more punishing than any loss he had ever suffered. In those hours of waiting, memories surfaced with a clarity that left him defenseless. He remembered the first time Katie trusted him after years of turbulence, the fragile hope in her eyes, when she believed that love might finally outweigh ambition. He remembered every promise he had broken in the name of control, every moment when protection had curdled into possession. Sitting beside her now, Bill understood with brutal precision how often he had confused power with care. The war he had unleashed against Forrester Creations, justified in his mind as righteous defense, revealed itself as something far more dangerous: a refusal to accept that he could not dominate every threat away from the woman he loved. Outside the hospital room, the consequences of Bill's campaign continued to unfold. Executives scrambled to interpret his silence, unsure whether it signaled escalation or retreat. Investors grew nervous, sensing instability beneath the carefully constructed narratives. The fashion world, once captivated by the spectacle of two titans clashing, began to recoil from the human cost emerging behind the headlines. What had started as a strategic offensive now risked becoming a liability no one could fully contain. At Forrester Creations, the pressure was relentless. Ridge Forrester found himself balancing fury with responsibility, determined not to allow Bill's vendetta to dismantle the company his family had built over generations. He recognized the familiar pattern in Bill's behavior, the way grief and fear transformed into aggression. Yet understanding did not soften Ridge's resolve. He refused to let Forrester Creations become collateral damage in a personal crusade masquerading as justice. Brooke Logan, however, was unraveling under the strain. Watching her sister fight for her life, while two men she loved stood on opposite sides of an escalating war, forced Brooke into an emotional purgatory she knew too well. She visited Katie daily, speaking softly even when Katie could not respond, trying to anchor her sister to the world beyond sterile walls and whispered diagnoses. At the same time, Brooke confronted Ridge with an urgency that stripped away all pretense. This conflict, she insisted, could not continue without destroying everything it touched. For the first time, Brooke was not asking Ridge to compromise for love, but to recognize that winning meant nothing if it cost them Katie. As days passed, Katie drifted in and out of consciousness, her condition stabilizing only to falter again without warning. Each setback tightened the invisible noose around Bill's heart. The doctors were careful not to offer false hope. They spoke instead of management, of vigilance, of the long road ahead. Stress, they warned, was not merely an external factor, but an ongoing threat, one that could undo even the most successful intervention. Their message was clear: Katie's survival depended not only on medicine, but on the environment she returned to. That reality forced Bill into an internal confrontation, more ruthless than any corporate battle. He began to see the war he had launched for what it truly was: a continuation of the very chaos Katie had spent her life trying to escape. Every aggressive maneuver, every headline engineered to weaken Forrester Creations, fed the cycle of tension that endangered her heart. Bill had sworn to protect Katie, yet his methods were slowly killing her. The recognition hollowed him out, leaving behind a man stripped of certainty. The turning point came quietly. Katie woke, during the early morning hours, her eyes searching the room until they found Bill. She did not speak at first. She simply looked at him, her gaze heavy with exhaustion and unspoken understanding. In that look, Bill saw fear, but not of death. It was fear of him, of what he might do next, of the damage his love might inflict even as it fought to save her. When she finally found her voice, it was weak, but resolute. She did not ask him to stop for the sake of morality or reputation. She asked him to stop because she wanted to live. That plea dismantled what remained of Bill's defenses. In that moment, vengeance lost its appeal, its logic, its justification. The empire he had built, the enemies he had crushed, the battles he had won, all of it paled beside the simple truth that none of it mattered if Katie's heart failed again. Protecting her meant relinquishing control, accepting that he could not shape outcomes through force alone. Bill's decision rippled outward with immediate impact. He froze hostile acquisitions, withdrew legal threats, and signaled a ceasefire that stunned the industry. Those who had expected escalation were left scrambling to reinterpret the landscape. At Forrester Creations, the shift was met with skepticism and cautious relief. Ridge did not trust Bill's sudden restraint, suspecting it might be another strategic feint. Yet Brooke sensed something different, something fragile and sincere beneath the surface. For the first time, Bill was not acting from dominance, but from fear of loss. The ceasefire did not erase the damage already done. Relationships remained strained, trust fractured, and reputations bruised. But it created space for reflection, for healing, for choices not dictated by rage. As the war cooled, attention returned to the hospital room where it had all begun. Katie's condition, no longer buffeted by external chaos, showed signs of cautious improvement. The doctors spoke of progress, of guarded optimism, of the possibility that her heart, given peace, might find its rhythm again. For Bill, the aftermath was sobering. Stepping back from the fight forced him to confront the emptiness that power had once filled. Without an enemy to battle, he was left alone with his regrets, his failures, and the daunting task of learning a different way to love. Watching Katie sleep, he made a silent vow, not to protect her through conquest, but to honor her boundaries, her strength, and her right to a life free from constant warfare. The fallout extended beyond Bill and Katie. Ridge and Brooke found themselves reevaluating their own patterns, recognizing how easily pride and history could eclipse compassion. The crisis exposed the fault lines that had always existed between legacy and humanity, ambition and care. It reminded everyone involved that the most dangerous battles were not fought in boardrooms, but within hearts pushed beyond their limits. As Katie slowly recovered, her presence became a quiet catalyst for change. Conversations once driven by rivalry softened, replaced by a tentative acknowledgement of shared responsibility. The war between empires did not end with a victor, but with a reckoning, a recognition that unchecked power, no matter how well-intentioned, carried consequences too heavy to ignore. Yet the story was far from over. The scars left by the conflict would not fade easily, and the choices made in its wake would define futures still unfolding. Bill Spencer had stepped back from the brink, but the question remained whether restraint would endure once the immediate crisis passed. Love had won this battle, but in a world defined by ambition and ego, victory was never permanent. For now, though, as Katie opened her eyes to a quieter world and Bill held her hand, without trying to control the outcome, something rare took shape between them, not certainty, not dominance, but hope. And in the fragile rhythm of her recovering heart, the possibility emerged that survival itself could become the most powerful statement of all.